So, imagine for a second that you get copied on this leaked email thread, right?
Oh, okay. Like a corporate leak.
Yeah, exactly. A
Mm.
leaked thread from a massive, highly successful organization,
Mm.
but it is just in total spectacular meltdown. I mean, I'm talking executives aggressively suing each other in public court.
Oh, wow. That is a mess.
It gets worse. There's this scandalous HR violation that somehow people in the office are actually bragging about. And the mandatory corporate retreats, they've completely devolved into these segregated, drunken frat parties where all the VIPs eat all the catered food before the entry-level employees even clock out of their shifts.
That sounds like a complete nightmare. You'd assume that's, the collapse of some toxic modern tech startup or maybe a corrupt Wall Street firm.
Right. But you aren't. What you are actually looking at is one of the most foundational ancient documents of the Christian faith.
Which is pretty wild to think about.
It really is. So today, our mission for you in this deep dive is to explore the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, which is usually just called 1 Corinthians.
Right, and we're going to be drawing heavily on a really comprehensive survey compiled by Chris R. Velasquez. His work is great for extracting the historical, the archaeological, and, the theological nuggets of this document.
Because this isn't just some dusty, abstract religious text. It's a dramatic, real-time intervention. This community is grappling with celebrity culture, political factionalism, sexual autonomy, and this massive tension between personal liberty and community responsibility.
It is incredibly relevant.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this, because the issues these ancient people were facing feel almost uncomfortably relevant right now.
They really do. And to really grasp the weight of this document, we have to look at its immediate context. Like, what is this thing? We are analyzing a letter written by the Apostle Paul, along with an associate named Sosthenes.
Wait, Sosthenes is listed as a co-sender.
Yeah, he is. And the mainstream historical consensus places the writing of this letter around AD 53 to 54, while Paul was staying in the city of Ephesus, which is right across the Aegean Sea from Corinth.
I find the inclusion of Sosthenes so fascinating. Because if I recall the timeline from the book of Acts, there was a guy named Sosthenes in Corinth who was a synagogue leader,
Yep,
right?
yes, exactly.
And he actually got beaten by a mob during a riot against Paul.
Mm-hmm.
So if this is the same guy, having him co-author a letter to that very city is just a pretty intense detail.
It really shows the personal history and the tension there. Sosthenes isn't just a scribe, he's a survivor of the city's chaos. And if you look at the New Testament canon, 1 Corinthians sits as the 7th book, right after Romans, but its function is completely different.
How so?
Well, Romans is this systematic, sweeping theological treatise. It's very structured. 1 Corinthians, on the other hand, is wildly practical. It is a highly situational, almost messy pastoral application of the gospel to a deeply fractured local church.
It's basically Paul doing crisis management.
Exactly. Crisis management for a community that is just coming apart at the seams.
But before we get into the drama of the letter itself, I mean, we really have to understand the environment that created it. Welcome to Corinth. This was the absolute crossroads of ambition. What kind of world are we stepping into here in the mid-1st century?
Well, the sheer economic and geographic power of the place cannot be overstated. I mean, ancient Corinth was situated on a highly strategic isthmus. That's the narrow strip of land connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese Peninsula.
Right, so it's a major bottleneck for basically everyone.
Exactly. And because of this location, it had access to 2 major harbors. You had Lycaeum to the west and Cenchreae to the east. Now, in the ancient world, sailing around the treacherous southern tip of Greece was incredibly dangerous. A lot of ships just wouldn't risk it.
So what do they do instead? Just unload everything and walk?
Almost.
Right.
Merchants would literally drag their smaller ships, or at least their cargo, across a paved trackway on the isthmus. It was called the Diolkos. And this made Corinth a massive economic hub. Goods and people from all over the Mediterranean were constantly flowing through it.
Wow. So whoever controls the choke point controls the wealth. It's like the ancient equivalent of the Panama Canal, basically.
That's a perfect analogy. The toll money alone made the city incredibly rich.
But the city Paul visited wasn't really an ancient classical Greek stronghold anymore, right? I mean, the Romans had completely overhauled it by this point.
Right, yeah. The original Greek city of Corinth was actually totally sacked and destroyed by the Roman Republic in 146 BCE. It lay in ruins for a full century, just completely abandoned.
100 years of just ruins.
Yeah. But then, in 44 BCE, Julius Caesar reestablished it as a Roman colony, and he populated it initially with freedmen, former slaves, and retired Roman soldiers.
Okay, so a totally different demographic.
Completely different. By the time Paul arrives, roughly a century later, it's the administrative capital of the Roman province of Achaia. But because of its origins, it didn't have the old money aristocracy of cities like, say, Athens. It was very much a new money town.
So it's mobile, cosmopolitan, and intensely socially stratified. I feel like that new money vibe changes everything about how a culture operates.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone is trying to prove they belong. People are climbing over each other.
And we aren't just guessing about this environment based on literary texts, are we? I mean, we have an immense amount of physical, archaeological data showing us exactly what this city looked like.
We really do. The American School of Classical Studies at Athens has been excavating the site of ancient Corinth since 1896. So we have well over a century of digging.
That's incredible. What kind of stuff are they finding?
Well, they've uncovered the Lycian Road, all these monumental remains, storefronts, and artifacts that span all the way from the Neolithic to the Byzantine period. But for understanding the timeline of this specific letter, one of the most crucial archaeological anchors actually comes from a related site in Delphi.
Oh, right, the Gallio inscription. I always hear historians bring up this specific piece of stone. But if we are trying to date a religious letter written to a church in Corinth, why does a random stone in Delphi matter so much?
That's a great question. Chronology in ancient history is notoriously difficult to pin down. Ancient historians didn't use our calendar system. They dated things by who was in power in the 5th year of Emperor whoever.
Right, which gets super confusing.
Very. Now, the book of Acts tells us that Paul was brought to trial in Corinth before a Roman proconsul named Gallio. But for a long time, we didn't know exactly when Gallio held that specific office.
So we had the name, but not the date.
Exactly. And then the Gallio inscription, found at Delphi, changes all that. It's actually a letter from the Emperor Claudius, carved into stone, and it specifically mentions Gallio as the proconsul of Achaia.
Okay, that's a cool connection. But how does that give us a year?
Because the inscription also mentions that Claudius had been acclaimed emperor for the 26th time, and we have other Roman imperial records that are very meticulous. By cross-referencing those records, historians can date that 26th acclamation precisely to the period between early AD 51 and August AD 52.
Wow. That is a massive piece of the puzzle. It takes Paul out of the realm of, abstract mythology and pins him to a specific, verifiable window in the Roman Empire.
It really does. It grounds the whole narrative. And furthermore, archaeologists in Corinth have excavated something called the bema.
The bema? What's that?
It was a large, elevated, public tribunal platform situated right in the center of the Roman Forum. It functioned as the official seat of the magistrate. Given the layout of the city and Roman legal customs, this is highly likely the exact physical structure where Paul stood trial before Gallio.
So you can literally go there today
Right.
and stand where this happened. The historical reliability of the setting is just deeply grounded. But since we are clearing up the historical reality of the city, there's a major cliche about Corinth that I think we need to tackle.
I know exactly what you're going to bring up.
Yeah, right. Whenever people talk about ancient Corinth, they always paint this lurid picture of a city completely overrun by temple prostitution, like 1,000 priestesses of Aphrodite coming down from the Acrocorinth every single night to seduce sailors. It gets described as the ancient equivalent of Las Vegas on steroids.
Yeah, Sin City of the ancient world.
Exactly. How accurate is that, really?
Well, modern scholarship strongly cautions against treating that caricatured narrative as settled fact. That dramatic description comes largely from a Greek geographer named Strabo.
Okay, so he was a primary source, though, right?
He was, but he was writing about the old Greek city of Corinth before the Romans destroyed it. And even then, historians think he was likely exaggerating or maybe misinterpreting Near Eastern cultic practices.
So he's talking about a city that didn't even exist in Paul's time anymore.
Precisely. The Roman Corinth of Paul's day was certainly a pagan city, and as we'll see, it was morally compromised in many ways. But the real pervasive danger in Corinth wasn't a cartoonish level of organized temple prostitution.
Okay, so if the primary civic religion wasn't just rampant debauchery, what was the actual poison in the water that these early Christians were drinking? What was the real issue?
Status. An absolute all-consuming obsession with status and social hierarchy.
Really? Just status?
Just status. But you have to understand how extreme it was. The culture of the Greco-Roman world and Corinth in particular, as a prosperous Roman colony, was built entirely on the patron-client system and these really intense honor-shame dynamics.
Okay, let's drill down into that because we hear those terms, but how did the patron-client system actually work on a day-to-day basis for the average person living in Corinth?
Well, in the Roman world, there was virtually no middle class, and there was certainly no social safety net. So society ran on a system of mutual but very unequal obligations.
Like a mob boss doing favors.
Kind of. A wealthy, high-status individual, the patron, would provide financial support, legal representation, and business opportunities to lower-status individuals who were his clients.
And what did the patron get out of this? Just the goodness of his heart.
Definitely not. In return, the clients owed the patron their political votes, their public loyalty, and constant social deference. It was a daily requirement.
A daily requirement, like you had to check in.
Literally. Every morning, clients would gather at the patron's house for a ritual called the salutatio. They were essentially lining up to greet him, receive a small daily dole of food or money, and demonstrate his public importance by the sheer size of the crowd he commanded.
So your entire survival and your social worth depended entirely on who you were attached to, who your patron was.
Yes, and how high up the ladder you could climb within that network.
That explains so much. Because, I mean, when people convert to a new faith, they don't just magically shed all their cultural conditioning, right?
Exactly. They bring their baggage with them.
So these believers walked into the church bringing their cultural obsession with social climbing and patronage right in through the front doors, which creates the very first major crisis Paul has to address in his letter, the rise of celebrity pastors.
Yeah, Paul opens his letter by addressing a deeply troubling report he received. He gets news from a group identified as Chloe's people. They had traveled from Corinth to Ephesus and brought him the news that the church is actively splitting into polarized factions.
They are essentially forming rival brands, like wearing different sports jerseys or something. You've got people saying, well, I'm on Team Paul. He founded the church.
Oh, right. And others are saying, I'm on Team Apollos. The text describes Apollos as an incredibly gifted, eloquent teacher. Very charismatic.
Then there's Team Cephas, using the Aramaic name for the Apostle Peter. I'm guessing that might have appealed to the more traditional Jewish members of the congregation.
Very likely, yes. It carried that original Jerusalem authority.
And then you have this final super spiritual sounding group claiming, well, I'm on Team Christ, which honestly sounds like the most insufferable group of all. Like, you guys follow mere humans. Our patron is Jesus himself.
It really is the ultimate trump card in a status game. But what you're seeing here is a complete fracturing of the community along the lines of civic patronage. They're treating these church leaders exactly the same way they treat wealthy Roman patrons.
So the mechanism driving this division,
Yeah.
it goes back to that Greek obsession with wisdom, right?
Yes, the Greek concept of Sophia, which translates to wisdom. In the Hellenistic world, persuasive speech, rhetorical skill, and philosophical prestige were the ultimate status symbols.
So it wasn't just about what you said, but how you sounded saying it.
Absolutely. The city was habituated to these public speakers called sophists. They would travel into town, deliver these dazzling public orations, gather wealthy disciples, and charge a lot of money for their elite wisdom.
Wow. So the Corinthians are basically treating Christian leaders like rival philosophers in the public square. They are grading Paul and Apollos on their stage presence.
Precisely that. And Paul notes this fundamental divide in chapter 1. He says the Greeks demanded intellectual legitimacy. They wanted soaring philosophical rhetoric. The Jewish population, on the other hand, demanded miraculous signs as proof of divine authority.
Okay, I'm stuck here, though. Why does Paul refuse to play the game?
What do you mean?
Well, if you want to convince a city of Greek thinkers that your message is true, why wouldn't you use the best rhetoric possible? Eloquence is a good thing. We value great speakers today. Is Paul just anti-intellectual? Does he think being smart is bad for faith?
No, Paul is absolutely not anti-intellectual. I mean, the very letter we are discussing is incredibly dense, it's logically rigorous, and thoroughly argued. What Paul is subverting is the performative rhetoric of his day.
Performative meaning, like all flash and no substance.
Yes, the kind of speech that relies on emotional manipulation and human charisma to build a personal following. He intentionally refused to use the flashy, elite rhetorical tricks of the sophists because he wanted their faith to rest on God's power, not his own personal charm.
Okay. That makes sense.
And what he offers them instead of elite philosophy is something deeply offensive to the Roman mind: the cross.
The idea of worshiping a crucified man, which, I mean, we wear crosses on necklaces today, so we've completely lost the absolute shock value of that symbol.
We really have. The Greek word is staros. To the Greco-Roman world, a crucified Messiah wasn't just strange. It was an oxymoron. It was a scandalous, humiliating failure.
Because it was literally the worst way to die.
The Roman statesman Cicero once described crucifixion as a most cruel and disgusting penalty. He said it was something so shameful that the very word shouldn't even cross the lips of a Roman citizen.
So polite society just pretended it didn't exist.
Exactly. It was a punishment reserved for slaves, rebels, and the absolute lowest of criminals. It was specifically designed to completely strip a person of their honor and status in a very public way. And yet, Paul makes this horrific instrument of execution the absolute center of his argument.
He argues that God's true wisdom is revealed in the very thing that the world considers foolishness. That completely inverts their honor-shame dynamic, doesn't it?
It shatters it.
Right. If the creator of the universe saved the world through the ultimate public humiliation, then their obsession with climbing the social ladder is just entirely incompatible with the gospel. You can't follow a crucified savior while desperately trying to look powerful.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Paul uses these really grounded agricultural and architectural metaphors. He's trying to deconstruct their factionalism. He says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow.
Basically saying, stop obsessing over the farmhands.
Right. He reminds them that he and Apollos aren't rival patrons at all. They are merely workers in God's field.
Going back to the sports analogy, it's like the fans in the stands are getting into violent fistfights over who the best player is, and the players themselves are turning to the crowd and yelling, we're on the exact same team, stop fighting.
That gets to the core of his theology of the church. The Greek word for the assembly is ecclesia. Paul is reminding them that the ecclesia belongs to God. Ministers are servants and stewards. They are not party founders or brand managers.
So when a congregation starts evaluating its ministers by their personal brand rather than their faithfulness to the crucified Christ, they have fundamentally misunderstood what the church even is.
Yes, they've turned it back into a Roman civic club.
And this obsession with looking powerful, with avoiding the shame of the cross, it completely warped their internal moral compass. Because if your only metric for success is how high you rank in society, you start rationalizing behavior that even the surrounding culture finds appalling.
Which is exactly what we see as we transition into chapters 5 through 7.
Right. The failure to grasp the humility of the cross didn't just affect how they treated their leaders, it deeply affected what they thought they had the right to do with their literal physical bodies.
The shift from chapter 4 to chapter 5 is abrupt, and it's incredibly severe. Paul moves from addressing their intellectual pride to confronting a profound moral disorder in the community.
And the most glaring example he brings up is shocking.
It is. It's a case of sexual immorality. The Greek word is porneia. That was so scandalous, even the pagan Romans, who were fairly permissive by our standards, were shocked by it.
This is the man who was involved in an incestuous relationship with his stepmother. But, I mean, the wildest part of this isn't just that it was happening behind closed doors, it's the church's reaction to it.
Their reaction is arguably worse than the sin itself.
They aren't ashamed. The text says they are puffed up. They're actually boasting about their tolerance of this situation. How do you even arrive at that kind of twisted logic?
It goes back to a toxic blend of Greek philosophy and their total misunderstanding of Christian grace. In the broader Hellenistic world, there was a prevalent dualistic philosophy, often associated with Platonic thought.
Dualistic meaning they separated the physical and the spiritual.
Exactly. They viewed the spiritual realm as pure and good, and the material realm, including the biological human body, as inherently corrupt or ultimately irrelevant. The Corinthians had actually developed a slogan for this. They loved saying, "All things are lawful for me."
Wait, are they quoting Paul back to himself? Because Paul preaches freedom from the Jewish law all the time. It sounds like they took his message of Christian liberty and weaponized it.
That is highly likely what happened. They took his teaching on grace and distorted it through their Greek dualism lens. They believed that because their souls were saved and they possessed this elite spiritual wisdom, what they did with their physical bodies simply didn't matter anymore.
So they completely compartmentalized their lives.
Completely.
Like, my spirit belongs to God, but my body is just biology, so I can do whatever I want with it. It's fascinating how that ancient philosophy really mirrors modern expressive individualism.
It really does. It's very contemporary.
Today, the cultural rule is my body, my rules. If a desire feels authentic to my internal self, I have the absolute right to physically express it. And this compartmentalization wasn't just happening in the bedroom in Corinth. It bled right into their civic lives too, right? They were dragging each other into secular Roman courts.
Yes, in chapter 6, Paul addresses the lawsuits. And once again, the underlying mechanism here is status and honor. By taking a fellow believer to court over financial disputes, they are using the Roman legal system to publicly assert dominance over one another.
They just can't let a slight go. They have to win in public.
Exactly. And Paul is horrified by this. He uses an eschatological argument, which means an argument based on the end times. He essentially asks them, if you are destined to judge angels in the age to come, how can you lack the competence to settle a minor property dispute among yourself?
That's a great point.
He's saying, why would you humiliate the church by airing your grievances in front of pagan judges?
He's pointing out a massive contradiction in their worldview. But how does he actually correct this underlying philosophy? I mean, if he's dealing with people who fundamentally believe their physical bodies don't matter, how do you argue against that? Do you just threaten them with divine punishment or give them a rigid list of moral rules?
He doesn't resort to simple moralism at all. Instead, he introduces a radical theological redefinition of the physical human body. The Greek word for body is summa. Paul tells them that the physical body, the summa, is actually a temple, a naos of the Holy Spirit.
Okay, we hear the phrase, my body is a temple, today, all the time, and we usually think it means like eating organic food or going to the gym. But in the ancient world, a temple meant something completely different, didn't it?
Entirely different. In ancient cosmology, a temple was the intersection of heaven and earth. It was the sacred space where the divine presence literally dwelled among humanity. It required absolute purity.
So it's not about being healthy. It's about housing the divine.
Exactly. By calling their individual physical bodies temples, Paul is saying that sexual ethics and physical behavior are not secondary biological issues. They are central gospel issues.
And he grounds this ethic in an incredible philosophical shift. He essentially says, you must honor God with your body because your body is going to be resurrected.
That's the key.
The pagans believed the body was just a temporary shell to be discarded at death. Good riddance, right. But Paul says, no, your physical body has an eternal destiny. It belongs to the Lord.
That is the crucial connection. The theology of the resurrection is the foundation of Christian ethics for Paul. Because bodies matter to God in eternity, they matter right now. He specifically targets the men who were visiting prostitutes.
Because they were probably the ones saying, all things are lawful.
Definitely. And he argues that when a believer unites their body with a prostitute, they are taking a body that belongs to Christ and dragging it into a union that contradicts the gospel. It's a metaphysical impossibility for a believer to compartmentalize their life that way.
You can't split yourself in half. And this realistic view of the body carries right over into his deeply practical advice in chapter 7, where he answers their specific questions about marriage and singleness.
Right, chapter 7 is very pragmatic.
What strikes me here is how nuanced he is. Because of this Greek dualism we talked about, some Corinthians took the body doesn't matter idea in the completely opposite direction. Extreme asceticism.
Exactly. While some use dualism to justify total indulgence, others used it to argue that to be truly spiritual, everyone should stop having sex entirely, even within marriage.
Wow. Just a complete shutdown.
Yeah, they thought denying the body elevated the soul. But Paul rejects that extreme asceticism just as firmly as he rejects the sexual immorality. He honors marriage as a good, proper, and mutually self-giving calling.
He even insists on the mutual authority husbands and wives have over each other's bodies, which, I mean, was a remarkably egalitarian concept in a deeply patriarchal Roman culture.
It was revolutionary for the time. Yet at the same time, he doesn't idolize marriage. He actually elevates singleness and celibacy, seeing it as a powerful way to serve God with undivided attention.
So he kind of demystifies both states of life. He doesn't treat marriage as the ultimate goal of human existence, and he doesn't treat singleness as a curse or just a waiting room for marriage.
Right, and the lens he uses to view both callings is what theologians call eschatological urgency. He talks about living in light of the present distress and the fact that the form of this world is passing away.
So basically, keep your eyes on the horizon.
Exactly. Because the ultimate reality is the coming kingdom of God, believers shouldn't be consumed with changing their social status, whether that's seeking to get married, seeking to get divorced, or even a slave seeking freedom as the ultimate source of their identity.
He addresses the calling of believers within their current social situation without baptizing the Roman social order itself. It's profound detachment from the status games of the world.
It really is.
But this tension between what an individual has the right or the freedom to do with their physical body and how that impacts the wider community, it extended way beyond the bedroom, didn't it?
It spilled out everywhere.
It went straight out the front door and into the public marketplace.
Which brings us to an ethical dilemma that might seem incredibly strange to a modern listener at first. The meat market. Ah, yes. The issue of food sacrificed to idols, which is covered in chapters 8 through 10, this is one of the most culturally complex sections of the entire letter.
I bet.
The central question was whether Christians could eat meat that had originated as a sacrifice in a pagan temple. And to understand why this was such a crisis, we really have to look at the mechanics of ancient city life. Religion in Roman Corinth wasn't a private weekend activity. It was woven into the economic and social fabric of the city.
Okay, so walk us through how this actually worked. If I'm living in Corinth, where am I buying my groceries, and how does religion get involved in that?
Well, most of the meat sold in the public market, which was called the Macellum, had originated in a pagan temple. When an animal was sacrificed to a god, like Apollo, only a tiny token portion of the meat was actually burned on the altar.
Oh, really? I always pictured the whole animal burning up.
No, that would be a waste of good food. The rest was either given to the priests, sold to the public meat market, or, and this is the key part, it was served in the dining rooms attached to the temples.
Oh, they had dining rooms in the temples.
No. Yes. Furthermore, these temple dining rooms functioned as the primary banquet halls and restaurants of the ancient city.
So if you're a business owner in Corinth, and the local Merchants Guild is holding its annual networking dinner, it's going to be hosted in the temple of a pagan god.
Almost certainly, yes.
Wow. So if you decline the invitation because you're a Christian and you don't want to be around idols, you aren't just missing a meal. You're committing social and economic suicide.
Exactly. You are cutting yourself off from patronage, from your civic identity, and from social belonging. It's a huge sacrifice.
Which is exactly why this issue threatened to tear the church apart. You had a group in the church who considered themselves the strong. These were likely the wealthier, more socially connected members who actually got invited to these banquets.
Right, the elites of the church.
And their theology was technically correct, right? Because they argued, based on their new Christian monotheism, that pagan idols aren't real gods.
Right. They were saying, since an idol is nothing, the meat is just meat. Therefore, they claimed they had the absolute right to go to these temple feasts, maintain their social standing, and eat whatever they wanted.
All things are lawful.
Oh, right.
There's that slogan popping up again.
It's their favorite excuse.
But then you had the weak believers. These were likely people from lower social classes who had maybe recently converted from paganism.
Yes. And for the weak, that meat wasn't just protein. It was still deeply psychologically associated with the demonic idolatry they had just escaped.
Triggered them.
Completely. When they watched their wealthy, strong fellow Christians casually eating meat at an idol's temple, it confused them. It destroyed their consciences and tempted them to slide back into pagan worship.
So Paul steps into this minefield, and his response is honestly a masterclass in pastoral theology, because he doesn't just side with the group that has the correct theology.
No, he doesn't. He agrees with the strong on their foundational theology. Yes, there is only one God, and idols are biologically meaningless. However, he issues two massive course-correcting warnings to them.
What's the first one?
First, he warns them about the spiritual reality behind the physical idol. While the statue itself is just wood or stone, he argues that actively participating in pagan cultic feasts flirts with genuine demonic danger.
Even if you don't believe in the idol?
Exactly. He uses the history of Israel in the Old Testament as a sobering example, pointing out how the wilderness generation fell into idolatry and faced God's judgment. He lays down a hard line. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons.
But his second warning is where he introduces the ultimate trump card for Christian behavior. It's not just about avoiding demons, it's about how you treat the person sitting next to you.
Yes, he introduces the rule of agape self-sacrificial love. In chapter 8, Paul writes this famous line, "Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up."
The strong believers were entirely focused on their correct theological knowledge and their personal individual rights.
Right. They were obsessed with being technically correct. But Paul tells them that if their assertion of their rights causes a vulnerable brother or sister to stumble and fall away from the faith, then they are not just being rude, they are sinning against Christ.
I always think of this using an analogy of driving. Imagine you're at a four-way intersection. Legally, your light is green. You have the absolute legal right-of-way to hit the gas and drive straight through.
Sure.
But what if you see a pedestrian who has stumbled into the middle of the intersection? You have the legal right to drive, but if you do, you're going to hit them. So what do? You slam on the brakes.
Yeah.
Having the right to do something doesn't mean it is beneficial, or in this case, loving. You yield your rights for the sake of the vulnerable person in front of you.
That is a perfect illustration. It's exactly what theologians call cruciform liberty.
Cruciform liberty. Cross-shaped freedom.
Exactly. Christian freedom is a real, tangible reality, but it is always subordinate to love. To drive this point home, Paul actually points to himself as the ultimate example in chapter 9. He spends an entire chapter outlining all the rights he legitimately possesses as an apostle.
Right. He has the right to get married. He has the right to be financially supported by the church for his ministry so he doesn't have to work.
But he voluntarily surrenders all of those rights. He works a grueling day job making tents in the marketplace so he doesn't burden them financially. He disciplines himself like an athlete training for the games.
And that athletic metaphor would have landed perfectly with this audience, wouldn't it? Because Corinth hosted the famous Isthmian Games every 2 years.
Yes. The Isthmian Games were second only to the Olympics in prestige. Paul uses that imagery of strict athletic training to explain how he restricts his own freedom for the sake of the mission and the gospel.
He's basically challenging the Corinthians to adopt the mindset of the cross in their daily social interactions. He is telling the wealthy, high-status Christians that their primary concern should not be asserting their civic privileges or maintaining their comfort, but actively seeking the good of their neighbor.
It's a profound shift in perspective. It requires letting go of your ego.
I want to pause here and ask you, the listener, to really reflect on this for a second. We live in a culture that elevates personal rights above almost everything else. Where in your life are you aggressively demanding your rights or your freedom in a way that might actually be damaging the people around you? Where might you need to yield the right-of-way for the sake of love?
That's a challenging thought, and that tension between the strong demanding their rights and the weak being trampled is the central fault line of this entire letter. And it didn't just happen out in the public markets or the civic temples.
No, it got much worse.
It reached its absolute breaking point when the church gathered inside closed doors for their most sacred ritual, Sunday worship.
The public rights versus private worship collision. If you thought the lawsuits and the meat market were bad, the way these people were treating the Lord's Supper is truly staggering.
It is an absolute disaster. In chapter 11, Paul addresses their corporate gatherings, specifically the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper.
Okay, let's set the scene for this.
To understand the mechanics of this chaos, we have to look at the sociology and the architecture of the early church. They didn't meet in massive, dedicated church buildings with rows of pews like we do today. They met in the private homes of the wealthier members.
Because the wealthy members were the only ones who had homes large enough to host a crowd of people. And earlier, you mentioned the patron-client system. The wealthy patron would host their clients. Do we have historical evidence of wealthy people mixing with the lower classes in this specific church?
We actually have an incredible piece of archaeological evidence for this exact dynamic, the Erastus inscription.
What's that?
Well, archaeologists working in Corinth discovered a large paving stone near the ancient theater with a Latin inscription that reads, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, paved it at his own expense.
What is an aedileship?
An aedile was a high-status civic official in charge of public works, markets, and the maintenance of public buildings. It was a position held by a man of significant wealth and civic ambition.
Okay, so a very important guy.
Very. Now, in the book of Romans, which Paul wrote from the city of Corinth, he sends greetings at the end of the letter from a man named Erastus, calling him the city treasurer or director of public works.
Oh, wow. So we have a Christian named Erastus, who is a high-ranking city official, and an inscription in the same city mentioning an official named Erastus, who is wealthy enough to pave a street with his own money.
While scholars debate whether we can definitively prove they are the exact same person, the identification is highly plausible. But even more importantly, it proves the sociological reality of the Corinthian church. People of significant wealth, power, and civic status were absolutely mixing with lower-class workers, freedmen, and slaves in the same congregation.
And that socioeconomic clash created a nightmare at communion. Because back then, the Lord's Supper wasn't just, a tiny wafer and a little sip of juice passed down a pew. It was a full, actual meal, an agape feast. But Roman domestic architecture actively promoted social segregation, didn't it?
Exactly. A wealthy Roman home was physically divided into different spaces based on status. The host and his most important guests of honor would recline on comfortable couches in the triclinium, which was the formal, intimate dining room.
So that's the VIP section.
Right. But the lower status clients, the poor and the slaves, would be seated outside in the atrium, the larger courtyard, and they would be receiving inferior food and watered-down wine.
And the Corinthians brought this exact cultural practice right into the Lord's Supper.
They did. And it was compounded by their schedules. The wealthy members, the ones who didn't have to perform manual labor all day, were arriving early to the gathering.
So they get there first, take the best seats in the triclinium.
Not only were they arriving early, they were eating all the premium food and drinking all the wine. By the time the working class members and the slaves arrived, after finishing their grueling daily shifts, the food was gone, and the rich members were literally drunk.
Just picture the visceral reality of that. You work a 12-hour shift of exhausting physical labor in the ancient world. You come to the church gathering, which is supposed to be the one place in the Roman Empire where you are treated as an equal brother or sister in Christ.
The one place.
Right. And you walk in, and the wealthy patron who owns the villa is passed out drunk on a dining couch, surrounded by empty plates of fine food, while you stand in the courtyard with a growling stomach. It is a complete mockery of what the meal is supposed to represent.
It is an utter desecration of the sacrament. And Paul's rebuke here is devastatingly concrete. He asks them, "Do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing?"
He doesn't hold back at all.
He warns them that whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. To shame the poor at the communion table is to eat and drink judgment upon yourself.
Because the table is meant to visibly enact the unity and the sacrifice of the gospel.
Yes. When they enforce Roman social hierarchy at the Lord's table, they are functionally denying the gospel.
They had completely ruined communion, but it wasn't just the meal that was chaotic. Their entire worship service was basically out of control, particularly when it came to how they used spiritual gifts.
The Greek word for these spiritual gifts is charisma. In chapters 12 through 14, Paul addresses the chaotic, competitive use of these gifts. The Corinthians, true to their cultural obsession with status and rhetorical performance, had turned spiritual gifts into weapons of self-promotion.
Especially the gift of speaking in tongues, right? Glossolalia. Why were they so obsessed with that specific gift?
Because speaking in uninterpreted tongues was spectacular. It sounded mysterious, elite, and deeply spiritual. It allowed the speaker to command the attention of the entire room, much like the sophist philosophers commanding a crowd in the forum.
So worship had devolved into a competition for who was the most spiritually elite.
It was loud, confusing, and completely self-centered. You had multiple people shouting over each other to show off their gifts.
They basically turned church into a hybrid between a VIP country club for the rich and a chaotic open mic talent show for everyone else to show off. I mean, how do you even begin to impose order on a gathering that dysfunctional?
Paul introduces one of the most famous and powerful metaphors in the entire New Testament to fix this: the body of Christ. In chapter 12, he argues that while the Holy Spirit gives a diverse variety of gifts, they are all given to one organic body.
So you aren't just independent operators.
Right. He personifies the body parts to show the absurdity of their arrogance. He says the eye cannot say to the hand, "I have no need of you." He argues that unity does not mean uniformity. True organic unity requires diversity, but it is a diversity where every single member is valued, interdependent, and absolutely essential to the health of the whole.
The entire purpose of the gifts isn't self-display at all. It's for what the text calls oikodoma, edification, building up the church. If your spiritual gift isn't building up the person sitting next to you, you are using it wrong. Which brings us perfectly into chapter 13. The famous love chapter.
Ah, yes. Love is patient, love is kind.
Right. We hear it read at almost every single modern wedding. And the language is beautiful, but when you rip it out of its original gritty context, you miss the entire point. This isn't a cute romantic poem about how a bride and groom should feel about each other. It is a fierce, targeted rebuke to a selfish, arrogant, chaotic church.
Context changes everything. Chapter 13 sits directly between chapter 12 and chapter 14, which are both about the chaos of spiritual gifts. Paul is essentially saying, you Corinthians boast that you can speak in the tongues of men and angels. You boast about your prophetic powers and your ability to understand all mysteries. But if you do not have agape, that active, self-sacrificial love, you are nothing but a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Love is not portrayed as just an emotion. It is the necessary mode of operation for all spiritual gifts. Without love, the gifts are actively destructive.
And he applies this directly to their worship gatherings in chapter 14. He tells them that prophecy, which in this context means speaking God's truth intelligibly to build others up, is far more valuable in a corporate gathering than speaking in uninterpreted tongues, which only builds up the speaker's ego.
Exactly. He insists that God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. Order matters because order allows for the edification of everyone present.
He is painstakingly trying to take a community that is fundamentally fractured along fault lines of class, intellect, and spiritual pride, and mold them into a cohesive body that actually reflects the self-giving character of their founder.
It's a monumental pastoral task.
It really is. But Paul knows that behavioral corrections aren't enough. I mean, you can't just tell people to act better if their underlying worldview is fundamentally broken.
You have to get to the root of the issue.
Right, to finally fix the root cause of all of this, the factions, the bodily autonomy, the civic compromises, the horrific abuses of communion, and the worship chaos. He has to point them to the one historical reality that changes the entire fabric of the universe, the mechanism that makes all of this theology work. Which brings us to the climax of our deep dive, the reality of the resurrection in chapter 15.
Chapter 15 is arguably the theological zenith of the entire letter. Throughout the letter, Paul has been addressing behavioral symptoms. Here, he targets the underlying disease. He discovers that some people within the Corinthian church were actually denying the future bodily resurrection of believers.
Hold on, how can you be a Christian in the first century and deny the resurrection? That seems like the one non-negotiable thing. What were they thinking?
We have to return to that Greek philosophical background again, specifically dualism. Many Greek thinkers viewed the material world and the physical human body as a prison for the soul.
So they hated the body.
They really did. The ultimate goal of salvation, in their minds, was for the pure, enlightened soul to finally escape the decaying physical body and exist forever in a pure spiritual state. The idea that the supreme God would take a physical, rotting corpse and raise it back to eternal bodily life was completely repulsive to them.
It felt crude to them, like set backward into the mud.
Exactly. So some in the church had concluded, okay, maybe Christ's resurrection was just a spiritual metaphor, or maybe he rose physically because he's the Son of God, but we certainly won't. Our salvation is purely spiritual.
And Paul drops the hammer on this logic. He argues that the two concepts are inextricably linked. He says, if there is no bodily resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. You are still in your sins, and we are of all people most to be pitied.
He doesn't mince words.
He really doesn't. The entire Christian faith completely collapses without the physical, bodily resurrection.
And to ground this massive theological claim, Paul lays out what is perhaps the most crucial piece of historical evidence in the entire New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 7, he recites a received gospel tradition.
Right. He says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and eventually to more than 500 brothers at one time."
The phrase, what I received, I delivered to you, is highly technical rabbinic language. It's the language used for the passing down of sacred oral tradition.
So he's not just making this up on the spot.
No, this passage is incredible because scholars across the theological spectrum agree that this is a pre-Pauline creed. This is a formalized statement of belief that dates back to within a few years, perhaps even months, of the actual crucifixion in Jerusalem. Paul is reminding them of the unshakable historical bedrock of the faith, verified by hundreds of living eyewitnesses.
And we aren't just taking Paul's word for it that this text existed. The manuscript evidence we have for 1 Corinthians is phenomenal, right? How early are the physical documents that prove this creed was circulating?
The physical manuscript evidence is one of the most exciting aspects of studying the New Testament. We have Papyrus 46, often referred to as P46. It was discovered in Egypt and is part of the Chester Beatty Papyri collection. Historians date it to the late 2nd or early 3rd century, which is remarkably close to the original writing.
What exactly is a papyrus codex, and why does finding one matter so much?
Well, in the ancient world, most literature was written on long, continuous scrolls. But early Christians rapidly adopted and popularized the codex format, which is essentially the modern book format, with separate pages bound together at the spine. It was more durable, easier to reference, and could hold more text.
And P46 is one of these early books.
Yes. P46 is a papyrus codex containing a major portion of the Pauline letters. The fact that we have this physical artifact proves how early, how widely, and how carefully these documents were collected, copied, and revered by the early church. We also have the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest complete New Testaments in existence, which preserves this exact text flawlessly.
That is just so cool. So Paul establishes the historical reality of Christ's resurrection. But then he takes it a step further to explain how Christ's resurrection impacts our future. He introduces this concept of Christ being the first fruits. How does that mechanism actually work?
The first fruits was an agricultural concept drawn directly from the Old Testament festival calendar. It was the very first sheaf of the grain harvest. When the priest offered the first fruits in the temple, it wasn't just a random sample. It was the absolute guarantee that the rest of the massive harvest was coming.
Ah, okay, a down payment.
Exactly. Paul is arguing that Christ's resurrection isn't an isolated one-off anomaly. It is the beginning of the end of the world. Because Christ has been raised bodily, it acts as the guarantee that all those who belong to him will also be raised bodily when he returns.
And this introduces what theologians call the already not yet tension.
That tension is the key to understanding Paul's eschatology, his theology of the end times.
So break that down for us. What's the already?
The already is that Christ has achieved decisive victory over sin and death on the cross, and he is actively reigning right now. Believers are already sanctified in him.
But the not yet.
The not yet is that the final subjection of all enemies, including the ultimate enemy of death itself, is still in the future. We live in the overlap of the ages. The decisive battle has been won, but the final reality hasn't been fully consummated yet.
But it will be.
At the end of history, Paul says, our current perishable, weak bodies will be transformed into imperishable, glorious spiritual bodies, perfectly animated by the Holy Spirit, just like Christ's resurrected body.
This is where I think the practical genius of Paul's theology is just undeniable. Because if you read this without thinking deeply, you might assume that focusing so heavily on the future, on the end of the world and the resurrection, would make people lazy in the present. You know the old saying, they are so heavenly minded that they are of no earthly good.
Right, you'd think it would lead to pure escapism, just sitting around waiting for the end.
It does the exact opposite. Look at how Paul ends this massive, soaring theological treatise on the resurrection. He doesn't say, therefore, just sit back, ignore the world, and wait for heaven to arrive. He says in verse 58, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain.
That is the crucial culminating takeaway of the whole argument. The future bodily hope is exactly what gives their present physical actions meaning.
Because it all lasts.
Yes. If the physical world is just going to be burned up and discarded like the Greeks thought, then nothing you do with your body matters. But because the physical world is going to be redeemed and resurrected, what you do with your physical body now matters eternally.
It changes everything. How you treat the poor and hungry at the communion table matters. How you handle your sexuality matters. How you yield your rights for the vulnerable in the marketplace matters.
How you use your spiritual gifts to build up the church matters.
Exactly. Your labor is not in vain, because the kingdom you are working for is the one that will physically, tangibly inherit the earth.
It perfectly ties the entire letter together. Every single issue he addressed, the celebrity pastors, the lawsuits, the incest, the idol meat, the chaotic worship, it was all rooted in their failure to grasp the physical reality of the resurrection and the profound humility of the cross.
So if we synthesize this vast amount of material we've covered today from Chris R. Velazquez's survey, the central thesis of 1 Corinthians becomes crystal clear.
It really does. The gospel narrative, the historical reality of the cross and the resurrection, is not just an abstract theological add-on to Christian ethics. It is the very engine of ethics. The cross destroys human boasting and the relentless pursuit of status.
Christian liberty is a real, bought and paid for reality, but it must always be constrained by self-sacrificial love for the community.
And the risen Christ, not human wisdom or performative rhetoric, must be the absolute center of the church's identity.
And that brings us back to you, the listener. As we wrap up this deep dive, I really want you to think about how eerily similar this first-century Roman colony in Corinth is to our modern culture. We are swimming in a world of expressive individualism, where your personal truth and your bodily autonomy are treated as the highest possible virtues.
We are drowning in celebrity worship and the branding of spiritual leaders.
We are constantly splitting into polarized, tribal factions based on who we follow or what social ideologies we align with. We are playing the exact same status games the Corinthians were playing 2,000 years ago.
And Paul's cure for the Corinthians remains the exact same cure for us today. He doesn't tell them to abandon the city, withdraw from the culture, and hide in a secluded bunker.
But he also absolutely forbids them from assimilating into the toxic values of the empire. He calls them to adopt a distinct, cross-shaped holiness right in the middle of the marketplace.
He demands that their community operate on a completely different frequency than the Roman world around them. A frequency defined by the humility of the cross, the organic, interdependent unity of the body, and the unbreakable, world-altering hope of the physical resurrection.
Remember that leaked corporate email we talked about at the very beginning of the show?
The organization tearing itself apart.
Yeah. The one with the lawsuits, the sexual scandals, and the elitist segregation. That was the Corinthian church. They were on the brink of total collapse. But because of Paul's intervention, because he forcefully reoriented their vision back to the crucified and risen Christ, they didn't collapse.
They survived.
They survived, they corrected course, and the text that saved them has been meticulously preserved for 2 millennia. So I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder today.
Go for it.
If the Apostle Paul were to observe your life and write a letter to your community, your workplace, or your social circle right now, would he recognize the sacrificial unity, the yielded rights, and the love of the body of Christ? Or would he just see a mirror, perfectly reflecting the status games, the pride, and the factions of the empire around you? Thank you for exploring with us. We'll see you on the next deep dive.